Today is January 14th, 2009, and we're at the home of, if you would give us your
My
name.
full name is Helen Gaither.
And where do you live, Mrs. Gaither?
I live right now on Arrington Road, Sykesville.
Where were you born?
I was born on Liberty Road over just about a mile east of Eldersburg, in the same house my father was born. I was born in 1925. I was born in the same house my father was born in 1882. His father had bought that farm just that year.
And I know you wanted to tell us a little bit about your Harris ancestors.
Yes, very definitely.
Go ahead.
Go ahead? Okay. My grandfather came to work, my great-grandfather came to work in the copper mines in the United States about 1850. He went back and forth to England several times with his family. He married in England, brought his wife along with him, and they had two daughters, one in 1850, one in 1852, both born in Maryland according to the census. They went back to England, or at least the wife and the two children went back to England, and he evidently was there also at times. His third child, my grandfather John Harris, was born in England in 1856. The mother and children stayed there until 1859 when John wrote a letter as an adult telling that he had come to this country in 1859 at the age of 3. At that time, another son was born to them in November of 1853, so they must have come here between June and November. They settled in March Road, on March Road in Freedom, and his father, John Harris, worked as a copper miner at Springfield Copper Mines.
Did he work at other copper mines earlier?
He had worked in Dolly Hyde, I think that's the name of it, in Liberty Town, which is where he was living 1850, and the first daughter was born there. According to Johnny Johnson, who's done a lot of research on the mining, he may have been working in Pennsylvania prior to that, but probably not too long. Then, of course, as an ancestor has told me that their great aunt Jane was the second daughter born. My ancestor, cousin that I used to know, who she is deceased now, said that her Aunt Jane had told her that the family went back to England a good many times in that period of time.
And what part of England did they go back to?
Near the little town of Truro, Cornwall.
In Cornwall.
It's copper mining and silver mining area.
So he came from a mining background.
Yes, and apparently the mines were running out in there, and they were looking for more work.
Okay. So when the family moved to March Road?
They settled finally on March Road. I think John Harris had been living with or renting a room, and had, over the period of time, had been working at the Springfield Copper Mines, which is on Fairhaven property now. And but by 1859 then, they settled down on a farm on March Road. And they stayed there for the rest of their lives. At least the parents did. He worked until he retired in the copper mine field. I took a tour with Johnny Johnson when he was giving one of those tours, and it was interesting. They gave me a piece of the rock, the ore that came out of the copper mines. It's very interesting to have. The one son, my grandfather John, became a harness maker. I think he learned the trade from a neighbor up the Liberty Road, a family that was a harness maker, and he probably apprenticed to that gentleman. He came to Sykesville by 1880. He was about 22, 23 years old. And to take up his business of harness making. I don't know where he lived or where his business was to start with. But he immediately became friends with a young man who was already started business in Sykesville, Ed Miller, Edwin M. Miller Jr., Senior, rather, excuse me. By 1881, Ed Miller Sr., whose family had come from England to this country, to Howard County, about the 1830s, at least by the time the railroad was coming through Sykesville. And they lived in the Howard County area, worked in in the milling line, the cotton mills. And Ed Miller was born over in Howard County in 1853. He began working, and by the time he was 14 years old, he was working for Zimmerman and Schultz Company, a general merchandise, I believe it was, on the Howard County side. All of Sykesville was on the Howard County side at that time.
That's right.
And he left them eventually and began working for John McDonald, another businessman in Sykesville. He and John McDonald became partners by 1887, I believe it was. No, 1887. He had already married a young woman who was living in Sykesville working as an operator. It didn't say what kind of operator, but I imagine it was a telegraph operator, I would think.
Probably.
He married Mary Williamson Lenham in the Springfield Church. That's the Presbyterian church up on the hill. In let me look at my notes. Oh my.
But Mr. Miller and your John Harris established a friendship.
Evidently, they established a friendship right away. He was married in January 1876.
Okay.
Was the year they were married at the Presbyterian Church. That was before John Harris had come to Sykesville.
Right.
And at that time, soon after that, he went into business with John McDonald, and they became partners, McDonald and Miller Company.
Mm-hmm.
But by the same time he went into partnership, Ed Miller decided he wanted to go into business for himself.
Okay.
So they dissolved the partnership. He took on a lease on a piece of property at the corner of Oakland Hill,
And
Oklahoma Road, and Main Street in
Okay.
Sykesville. And he had a building built, and opened up a general merchandise store within a year. His family started, was about 1880, or first child was born a couple years before that, I believe. And they probably lived in the back of the store on First Street, on the main floor, or on the second floor, because most of those buildings, when they were built, had a second floor, I have
Right.
found. The second floor was often used as a social hall.
uh,
He continued to improve his store and continued to take on more merchandise and enlarge the business. But by 1880, when John Harris had come to Sykesville, and they were good friends, the two of them bought 5 acres of land in Sykesville across the street on the east side of town, overlooking the railroad. It was on a hill. The Mr. McDonald, who was a blacksmith, I believe, and then went into selling metal stoves and tinware, had bought the top of the hill and had built a house up there. So John and Ed bought these 5 acres of ground. I wish I knew how much, but I don't know the amount they paid for it. John immediately began digging out the bank. Now they own the hill, and the south side of the hill dropped right straight off down to the level of the river.
You're
or the
talking
railroad
about the area
tracks.
now where Southern States is.
Yes, behind the McDonald's Stone Building,
Mhm.
and there's Shots lawnmower service there too, in that general area where
Right,
Southern
just
States
down,
is.
just below the Catholic Church.
Yes, he dug out that bank to put in a harness shop.
Mhm.
Within a couple months, he was open for business, and the Democrat Advocate paper stated that he was doing a thriving business already as soon as he opened. By 1883, apparently John knew he wanted to get married. So they probably already knew what they were going to do with the property. They would divide it in half. John got the half facing the railroad track in the river, where his harness shop was already built in the bank. That was right next to the Catholic Church, which had been built about 1860s or 70s.
Yes, I think you're about right.
And they divided the property in half. John immediately began digging out the foundation of a house up on his half of his property. Another month or so, the Democrat Advocate paper, this Westminster paper, but they had a reporter from each little town to send in the news of the town. The Democrat Advocate paper stated that John Harris could be seen plumb bobbing his framework to get his house framed up. That was in the summertime. By 1884, November, he and his girlfriend got married. Married Irene Alberta Steele.
Daughter of a physician, I understand.
Beg pardon?
Daughter of a physician.
Yes,
The local
she was a
physician.
daughter of, Dr. Joseph Wesley Steele, who was a physician. He lived in Eldersburg, but he was a physician for the general area.
Right.
Yes, and his father, in fact, had been a tanner, had lived in the old tavern in Freedom. Was it called the Littles Tavern?
Or Steele's Tavern.
Or-
It had a couple of names, I think.
Yes, okay. So they got married, they moved into the house. Now the house, from the pictures I have of the house, it looks like it was built in 3 sections. I don't know which section John built first. I suspect it was maybe the center section. But the front section is the only part that has a basement under it, a cellar, a dirt cellar under it. But obviously, as the children grew, they had to add on to the house, so it's obvious that was. But I don't have the records of who built it. Whether I don't think John built the whole house himself. I don't know. I have no records of that. His first child was born about they were married in 1884. His first child was born about 1886. The second was born about 1887 or 88.
Right.
Marion Harris was born 1889. Margaret Harris, the next daughter, was born 1891. Helen was born 1892. My mother, Adele Harris, was born 1894. Another daughter was born, Laura, was born 1896 or 86, I believe. A baby was born that died within that year, and so I'm not sure whether the baby was born before Laura or afterwards. There were 2 more boys born then. First one was born in 1901. That was Paul, who became a Methodist minister. And the last child was born in 1903. That was James. He was the last one to die, too.
And they had a large family rather quickly.
Yes,
Typical of the times.
that's right. In the meantime, Ed Miller had a large family also. He had, his first child, I believe, was Brooks, then Harry, then Ed Miller, then Ed Miller, I believe, and then Frank, and then Dorothy. They also had one little baby daughter that died, named Adele. And that little one, as I say, is featured in, is memorialized in the stained glass window of St. Paul's Church. The boys, as they grew up, were helping in the grocery store, in the store. Ed Miller had taken in, he was quite a worker. He didn't just sit down with his one little grocery store. He added on notions, he added on Christmas things at Christmas time, opened up the second story for a Christmas display, and the papers tell us who the young girls were that worked in the store. One of the sons opened up a gents store, G-E-N-T-S, gents store, in the arcade building, the big white gray stone building.
I'm sure your mother remembered some of those stores.
Yes, but I've done a lot of research through the Democrat Advocate, thanks to Thelma Wimmer, because she had already done the handwriting copies from the Democrat Advocate some years before that. And I researched all of her handwriting items, and then began going through the Sykesville Heralds also, as they were started in 1913. Ed and, well, I can remember my mom talking about the Miller family. She was crazy about the Miller kids.
Well, they were all grew up with her children, with her siblings.
Well, my mom was, I have a picture of my mom driving a car, or sitting in a car with, I think it's my Aunt Helen and Margaret both sitting in it also, with their 3 or 4 little children. And I didn't know who they were. I figured they were Miller's children, but I didn't know. When I decided to start researching my grandfather's Harris family, my mom had told me how friendly, how fond of each other they were, the Miller families and the Harris families. And she told me, I've got to get my thoughts straight here now. Did you cut that thing off for a while? Wait a minute now.
Don't even worry
Let me
about
check
it.
my notes here.
Yeah, give you take a breath.
Okay.
Okay. Take a
John-
deep breath.
John, as I say, had built his harness shop in the bank of the old property that they had bought in 81. Sometime or other, between I'd say 1890, about 1890, he bought a building on Main Street, about a half a block up the street from where Ed Miller had his grocery store. He was still doing his harness business in that building. As I say, I have a letterhead showing, oh, I hate to do this.
We'll copy that.
Okay, I have a letterhead dated 1897, and it's so impressive. I think that he must have had his business on Main Street by that time, 1887. But by 1901, he was getting very tired of working harness, and his son, Marion Harris, was 12 years old. During the summertime, he would sit there in the store, in the business, and he and his father would play checkers, according to Uncle Marion. They would play checkers. One day, Uncle Marion has always told this story, that his father, John, was saying he's getting very weary, with his hands are just wearing out, and he didn't know what he was going to do. Uncle Marion said, "You've got all this building with only a little bit occupied with your business. Why don't we put some shelves up over there on that wall and start some groceries?"
Right.
Now, my mom told me over the years that her mother said, "John, we've got all these children to feed. You really ought to see about buying some groceries wholesale." It so happens they did. Father John had a cousin up in Frederick County. His father apparently had had worked the copper mines along with Father John, copper miner, because he was listed in the Dollywood
Oh,
copper
okay,
mines.
so they were connected.
Also, that was Thomas Harris. So by this time, it may have been his son
Mhm.
had a wholesale grocery business in Frederick City. So my grandfather John and his son Marion went on the train to Frederick to talk to his cousin in Frederick County about giving him
Mhm.
credit. And it was either Thomas or James at that time, said, be happy to give you the credit all you want. Give me your order, I'll ship it down on the train, next train down. So they came on home and shipped this order down. Sometime or other they got shelves put up. All the merchants in Sykesville were kidding them, saying, how in the world are you going to get that big grocery order, those big cartons, up the street, through the mud? And Uncle Mary's story was that he got his horse and they got a slab and they got everything loaded up and pulled it up to the store. That's how the grocery business started. Well, it wasn't long, it couldn't have been any more than a couple of years before they were selling probably men's shoes and men's work pants and such things. Well, by that time, Uncle Mary had quit school. He was only 12. He had quit school, and I figured he was in about the 4th grade and had maybe 2 more years to go.
Mhm.
In the 6th grade, and had maybe 2 more years to go. 6th grade. By that time, Margaret was finishing school in Sykesville, and she'd been helping out in the stores anyway during the summertime and on evenings. So she started working in a store. In another year, Helen was finishing school. She wanted to go on to high school. She didn't want to work in the store, but she did help in the store when she was needed. But when she finished school at Sykesville, she went on the train to down to Baltimore and went to Western High School. Then my mom came along. She loved working in the store. By 1910 or 11, John Harris had already bought the building next door.
Mhm.
There was a large alley about wide enough for horse and buggies to get through, so it was a drive-through alley. He had bought the building next door, and he turned the management over to Margaret of that department store. In a few years, I'm sure it was before my time, when I was born in 1925, I'm sure it was before that or about that time, they decided to close in that alley.
Mhm.
And connected the 2 stores, so there had one big,
store.
there were openings through each. I mean, you go from the grocery store into which became the men's store and then became the department store for the ladies and babies. And my mother continued to work there until she got married in 1920. Margaret never married. She was dedicated to her business.
Do you remember going to the store as a child?
Oh, yes.
What kind of things do you remember?
I always remember seeing a big baby doll in the baby showcase. I remember seeing that baby doll. Also, this was told to me, I don't remember this. When I was a little kid, before school, I could go to school. I was 3 or 4 or 5 years old. My mom wanted me to go to school. I was playing with another friend, Angeline Leatherwood, up the road, but we couldn't walk back and forth on the main road. We could only do it when somebody brought her down or took me up there. So my mom asked Sam Janis, who was principal of Sykesville School, if we couldn't enroll when we were 5 years old, Angeline and I. And he had let some other children enroll, started school when they were 5 years old. So he said yes, he would. And I have a vague recollection that it was on 2nd Avenue, the school.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
And I seem to think her name was Miss Rouge, but nobody recognizes that. But within 3 or 4 weeks, Sam Janice told my mother, "You have to take those 2 girls out. The classroom is too crowded."
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was back home with nothing to do. My mom tells me that I developed 3 little friends. It may have been before that school episode, I don't know. I developed 3 little friends, Mary, Sissy, and Betty. And they lived up in the woods. And I would play with my baby dolls and my toys at home, and I would always include Mary, Sissy, and Betty with these.
Right.
So when Mom would take me down to the store, a young man that was working for Uncle Marion was Leroy Day. And she told Leroy about my friends. Every time I went to the store, he'd ask me how my little girlfriends were. And I'd tell him all sorts of stories about what these little girls and I did. Then, when I finally started first grade, and my mother took me down to the store after I started first grade, Leroy asked me about my little friends, Mary, Sissy, and Betty, and I said, "They've gone away." He said, "Gone away? Where?" And I said, "Well, they just went away. They lived up in the woods. They never lived in the house with us." And I said, "Well, they've just gone away." And that was the end of them.
That's a cute story.
But I can remember in the department store, there was a little room in the back for storage, and it was also had a little wood seat with 2 little holes in it, you know. It was a restroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember going back there.
Mm-hmm.
And that cold air coming up from
Coming up from below.
Yes, I can remember that. But mainly I remember the baby doll. So when
Did you buy clothes for? Did your mother buy clothes for you there?
oh yes, my Aunt Margaret would buy clothes. I had a brother. She bought clothes for James and me. She bought me an outfit. I don't remember as a little child, but as a high school age, she bought me an outfit every year,
Mm-hmm.
either spring or winter. My Uncle Paul Harris, as I say, was a minister in Washington, D.C. He had 2 daughters and a son. She bought them an outfit every year. She was good-hearted. She was such a sweetheart. But I was always a little bit afraid of her, and my Aunt Margaret.
What about candy and things like that?
Candy?
At the store, did you get
I
treats?
don't remember too much about candy. I do remember at Christmas time, that center section, the 3rd section, where they closed in the 2 stores, was the men's store. And I remember that they had shoes all lined up on one side. The back part was the men's men's shoes and men's pants and work pants and jackets and so on. And then in the back end of that center section was the office. It had a big desk, and Mr. Scott, I try to remember that man's name and I've forgotten it.
How about the ladies' department? What did it look like?
From the picture, there are 2 plate glass windows,
Mm-hmm.
and you walked in the center in the doorway with these picture windows on each side. On the left side was the baby showcase, right? As you went in the door, there's the counter all the way down, and they had baby clothes and then ladies' lingerie and such things. And then behind that, you had to go through and come back. Behind that then was the shelves on the wall that held babies and children's clothing. On the right side was another counter that went all the way down. On the wall behind the counter were bolts of fabric, spools of thread, all kinds of notions, of course. And then the cash register was about at the end of that counter. From those 2 counters where they stopped, the door went into the center section, down to the grocery store. Behind that, there were ladies' dresses and gowns and such things on racks. And then behind that was the little storage shed, storage room with the toilets.
What about the grocery area?
The grocery store was, again, it was a center door. No, there's 2 doors. In my teenage years, I know there were 2 doors you could go in. There were 2 doors with a Uncle Marion had his cash register and his counter where you would take your money, so on, add up your grocery list, was in that center. You could go in on that side or this side of it, and then there were meats and canned goods displayed on each side. He had Henry Forsyth worked for him in the very beginning, I believe. When I was a child, Henry had opened up his own grocery store. By that time, in the 1930s, he had opened up his own grocery, 40s maybe, in the same building that Ed Miller had originally started his business, because he was no longer in business down there. They were gone. Behind the center door that connected the three stores, there was a cold meat case that showed meats, and
Where did they get their meats?
I don't know.
Local farmers, or did?
I don't know. I really don't know, because my dad was a farmer and a butcher. Now, I know he never sold meats to the grocery store, or to Marion Harris. But I have no idea where they got their meats. I have a vivid memory of my mom buying a quart of oysters, already shucked out, a quart of them. And they had these little teeny crabs, little orange crabs. And I just loved those. I was always tickled when she bought a quart of oysters.
She get the oysters maybe for the holidays, or?
Well, she fried oysters. She made oyster stew, oyster pot pie. She never put the oysters in the turkey dressing. I can remember, even after we were married, after we were married, we'd go down to the store, and by that time Uncle Marion had died and had turned the business over to Jack. And I was married in 1946, and we lived in the old Harris house, which had been turned into apartments, and then my mom bought it. My mom and Daddy bought it when they sold their farm in 1946, and bought the Harris house from my Aunt Margaret, who was still owning it. And she had made it into 3 apartments. So my dad and Mom lived there in the one apartment in the back end of the house, which had the first and second floors both. There was another apartment that was on just the first floor, and another apartment on the second floor. So Charlie and I lived on the second floor after we were married. I'd go down to get groceries, and if I wanted a steak or a roast, Les Holman was the meat man. And he would cut off a piece of beef, cut off all the fat, trim it up real nice and clean, scrape the salt mess off the top of it, and weigh it and pack it up nicely. It was always delicious. Always, you never had to what are you doing?
Tenderize.
Tenderize?
Tenderize it, yeah. Never had to tenderize it or soak it in something, to tenderize it.
It was ready to.
It was just ready. Good steak, good food.
What year did the store close? About.
Well, Aunt Margaret died in 1955. She sold her share of the department store, sold that about 1947. She'd had a stroke. She'd had several mini strokes, I think. And she sold it about 1947. At the time she did that, I forget who bought it first. It was in two different hands at the time before it finally closed up. But at that time, she took the clock down. The clock that my grandfather Harris had bought for buying a barrel of harness for. It was a Baird clock. And she took the clock down and put it up at her. She was living with Mr. and Mrs. Millard Weir on Church Street. And she put the clock up in the attic. She took the baby doll out of the case. And she didn't I don't think she gave me that baby doll. I probably didn't, I'd have to check my records though. I probably didn't get that baby doll until she died. I'm not really sure about that. But when, after Aunt Margaret sold, the department store finally closed up, I think about 1970s, in the 1970s.
Because there are a lot of people around who still remember it as
Yes,
Harris's
yes.
store.
I do have the dates, but I can't go
That-
look them
that
up now,
gives-
can
that gives
I?
us- Yeah, that gives us a
All right,
rough
now,
idea.
now the grocery store, Uncle Marion died, well, before he died, he turned the business over to Jack,
Mhm.
and Jack managed it. Jack was quite crippled up. He was healthy otherwise, but he had some type of a disease that had him very crippled, and he was in constant pain, but he stuck with his job. When his father talked to him to come down and help him in the store
Mhm.
at the cash register. He didn't have to get up and walk around. He could just sit there at the cash register. And he had a good friend, I'll tell you that later.
It's
It doesn't
okay.
come to me. When Jack had the store, Les Holman was no longer working. He had retired, and it was Richardson. Wade Richardson was working in the back of the meat counter. And Jack had it for about maybe 10 years. And he decided he had to sell it. He was just getting too bad a shape, and he had to sell it. And Wade Richardson bought the meat store. Then they put a sign up, still use the name Harris
Right.
Market. The people that had bought the department store continued to use the Harris
Right.
department